Ethiopia has been a partner to my organization for decades. Unfortunately, I would say, because when countries are partners to my organization, it's not a very good situation. It means there is a problem. And of course, Ethiopia being in this troubled part of Africa and part of the world, it has always been at the receiving end of many refugee flows, and it continues to be at the refugee end. But Ethiopia has always been, and I remember from my very young days when I was a field officer in this region, Ethiopia has been a very generous host. And from all that we heard today, from government representatives, from civil society, this generosity will continue. In my many visits to Ethiopia, I think I've come here practically every year since I started this job 9.5 years ago. I have seen not only the generosity continue, but I have also seen a very, very forward-looking policies and approaches towards refugees grow. And I have seen them grow in a very pioneering way. In a very pioneering way that made Ethiopia a leader in the establishment of a global compact on refugees in 2018. After that, Ethiopia was one of the 5 co-conveners of the first Global Refugee Forum in 2019. And it has really been an example in the region and beyond in applying the proposals, the approaches that the toolbox which the global refugee, the global compact on refugees has offered to member states. I always say, when does this approach that the compact proposes, when does it work? It works essentially when states have inclusive refugee policies, and when donor partners, states or international financial institutions or the private sector, come up with adequate resources. When you have this combination of resources and policies, it works. And this is what has happened in Ethiopia, and this is what this approach that you call Makatet, inclusion, represents. In the progress in legislation, the proclamation of 2019 is one of the big positive examples globally in refugee policies, and I've seen it in practice. This has not been mentioned, but I remember I've been to all parts of Ethiopia in every visit, and I remember that as one of my brightest moments in this almost 10 years, when I visited Melkadida in southern Ethiopia. Melkadida is an extraordinary experiment in new approaches in how to deal with refugees while supporting the host communities. There are some favorable circumstances there, probably, but the investments that were made there, going far beyond the purely humanitarian, have been extraordinary. And they have been extraordinary thanks, surely, to partners like the IKEA Foundation, partners in the private sector, partners in the international financial institutions, but they have been possible because the government has given that space for these policies to be implemented. And I think that, my strong encouragement is for this, amidst all the challenges, to continue. I've been looking and reading about Makatet. I really want to applaud because all the key areas of inclusion are covered. Usually we think of services, right? Inclusion in health and education. This is fundamental, as we heard from the state ministers. Inclusion in work. This is very important in terms of self-reliance eventually. perhaps one of the most difficult areas. But here it goes beyond that. There is also an effort to include through proper documentation, through developing digital connectivity, land allocations in order to move from the traditional camps to settlements, intervention around climate action, because climate action and refugee work are intertwined many, many different ways. So it's really a very comprehensive approach that Makatet represents, and I want to applaud it. I know it's still at the beginning. We're talking about a roadmap. So the benefits are still limited, but I really encourage all that participate, that partner, to continue. Now, this is a big effort on the part of Ethiopia, but here I want to refer to what I always do. You know, the preamble of the Refugee Convention says very clearly that refugees are an international responsibility. Ethiopia does a lot, opens up borders, gives land, gives space, now gives access and inclusion. It is important that the international community does its work and contributes financially, with capacity building, technical expertise. There's many ways through which this contribution can happen. Of course, through humanitarian support that continues to be needed, but even more importantly, through development support. You know, we heard Mariam speak about the World Bank. I want to single out the World Bank here because I think since the compact was established and we started working with the World Bank here was one of the first countries where we really implemented what is now the window for host communities and refugees under IDA. But we started even before in Ethiopia, in Uganda, in Kenya, in this region. And I hope I'm not using the wrong figures, but almost $900 million have been put in projects that are related to refugees. They're not all for refugees. They are for host communities, for the government. These are largely bilateral, but I think it's a tangible sign. $900 million is not small. It's much more than what UNHCR has mobilized in the same period of time, or equal at least, through humanitarian sources. So we need, when we talk about aid and the decline of aid, we need to look at it comprehensively. There is here a new track of aid that is emerging, which I think is very, very important. You know, everybody always, I go to so many events in which people say, we need to really seriously think about the nexus between humanitarian and development. Well, here the nexus is already happening. It's not perfect, there's a lot of things that we need to do more, but this is the nexus. If the World Bank deals with refugee ID cards and supports the government in issuing them and deals with inclusion of refugees in education, that's the nexus. The World Bank is not a humanitarian agency and should not be a humanitarian agency. The World Bank is a development agency, the reduction of poverty, for supporting development, and the fact that they include refugees in this approach, to me, is quite a revolution that when I was younger, I wouldn't even have dreamt of. So there is progress. It's a long way to go, but there is progress that I want to flag. Of course, I think we should not hide it, and many of you have mentioned it today. Humanitarian aid is being challenged at the moment, is under an enormous pressure, and development aid to an extent as well. But humanitarian aid bore the brunt of what we're witnessing now, resources moving to other parts, to defense, to security, to other economic measures, and away from international assistance. I'm worried about that. I'm very worried. My organization is reducing its footprint by 1/3 around the world, and we're one of the largest refugee organizations, and many of you are going through the same. Look, and to conclude, and as I approach myself the end of my own tenure as the head of UNHCR, I have just a few final messages to share with you. One is, once all this is said and done, please, and this is a strong appeal to our donor friends, keep humanitarian assistance strong, because as we jointly develop this sustainable approach, we cannot rule out, in fact, we shouldn't rule out the possibility of new crisis. This is a very volatile region. We have the Sudan war just next door, South Sudan very unstable, Somalia very fragile. These are the places from which the refugees in Ethiopia have come for many years, and we see, as we speak, this continuing. So humanitarian assistance will continue to be needed to save lives and to respond to the crisis approach. And I would encourage you, in the appropriate fora, to encourage other countries to come on board. In other countries are still suspicious. They think that this is a way to dump refugees on host countries. I can understand in this present climate this concern, but I think you're proving the point that this is different. And I think, please help us convince other countries to move in this direction, countries in Africa and countries beyond Africa. And here I address myself to my colleagues in the UN, in the aid communities, to donors. I strongly believe, and I'm very proud, that in these years in which I have been the High Commissioner for Refugees, we have made such advances in a number of countries, in at least a dozen countries, mostly in Africa, I have to say. Because if we can make this progress in the so-called nexus, in the refugee sphere, this is also possible in other spheres, and I know that efforts are being made. Food security, for example, or climate action, economic inclusion, getting out of the vicious circle of handouts, dependency, and crisis that is interrupted and then starts again. I really want to applaud the government of Ethiopia's effort towards self-reliance and self-sufficiency, getting away from the dependency on aid. So these are all contributions, and what we're doing in the refugee sphere can be a contribution toward that very good effort. So thank you very much, Ethiopia, and when I say Ethiopia, I say all of it, not just the government. Thank you very much, Ethiopia, for what you're doing. This morning I had the privilege, I was with Taiba. I thank the President of Ethiopia for these efforts, but this thanks has to be extended to all the government and the local government, to civil society, but also to all donor and other partners that are here.
Ethiopia is home to over 1.1 million refugees, families and individuals who have sought safety and hope within our borders, many for more than a decade. This population includes some of the most vulnerable: children, women, persons with disabilities, and the elderly, but also individuals with immense skills, resilience, and potential. Our country has long maintained a proud tradition of hospitality, and today we stand at a defining moment in that journey. A moment where we move beyond the traditional humanitarian paradigm toward a whole of government and a whole of society approach, an approach grounded in the principle that refugees are not just beneficiaries of aid, but active contributors to our communities and our economy. Recognizing this, Ethiopia has chosen the path of inclusion, not isolation, not encampment. Today's dialogue is both timely and critical. It brings together diverse voices from federal and regional governments, development partners, the private sector, academia, and importantly, refugee communities themselves. Our aim is clear: to assess the progress made, identify gaps and opportunities, and forge a stronger partnership that can support the inclusion of refugees while strengthening the resilience of the host communities. We must ensure that our efforts are not only technically sound and financially supported, but also rooted in the voices and experiences of refugees and host communities themselves.